The morning Granite Ridge fell silent. Even the wind seemed afraid to move. A week earlier, gunfire had thundered through those same mountains. Now only echoes and questions remained. Locals whispered about a hidden network called Project Haven, about children kept in the dark, and a government man who vanished into it. But one soldier didn't walk away. Mason Cole, a former Navy SEAL who came to Wyoming to escape his ghosts, found something worse waiting in the snow. A secret buried so deep, even the law wanted it left alone. Alongside his loyal German shepherd, Ranger, he uncovered the truth inside a cave no map dared to name. And what they pulled from that darkness would change everything the town thought it knew about safety, faith, and silence. Some say you can still hear Ranger barking on cold nights, guarding the ones no one else could hear. Do you believe stories like this could happen where you live? Comment your hometown below or just write Amen for those who were finally found. The wind came down Granite Ridge like a blade that morning. Sharp, cold, unrelenting. Mason Cole adjusted the collar of his worn canvas jacket and took another slow step through the pines. Snow crunched beneath his boots, the sound swallowed by the sigh of trees and the distant creak of frozen branches. 5 years of living up here had taught him the rhythm of silence, the kind that was heavy, the kind that carried ghosts. Ranger, his 5-year-old German shepherd, trotted a few yards ahead, tail held level, nose sweeping across the wind. The dog was built like an athlete. Thick shoulders, dark sable coat streaked with silver near the haunches, a face both intelligent and scarred. One ear folded slightly from an old wound. Fallujah, Mason remembered, and the faint limp that appeared whenever the temperature dropped below freezing. The two of them moved like shadows between the trees. Mason preferred it that way. After 12 years as a Navy SEAL, 2 deployments in the Middle East, 1 classified operation that had left more than shrapnel behind, quiet was the only company he could keep. He'd lost his marriage, his squad brothers, and most of his sleep somewhere between Ramadi and home. Up here, no one asked questions. He'd built the cabin himself, a square box of cedar and stubbornness. There was a radio, a generator, and a wall of photographs that he never looked at. Ranger had come later, a rescue K9 that no one else wanted. The dog had seen war too. Maybe that was why they understood each other without words. That morning should have been like any other. Coffee gone lukewarm, a walk through the ridge, a check of the traps before noon. But halfway across the frozen ravine, Ranger stopped. Not the kind of pause that meant a squirrel or deer. This was different. The shepherd's body went rigid, hackles lifting in a wave. A low growl rolled out of his chest, deep and warning. Mason froze. "What is it, boy?" Ranger didn't look back. His nose pointed toward a limestone outcrop hidden by thickets of frost-bitten brush. The ridge rose there, steep and gray, like a scar on the mountain's face. Mason felt it before he saw it. The subtle change in the air, the faint tang of metal and decay. He slipped off his gloves, crouched, and pushed through the brush. Beneath the crusted snow was something unnatural, a fold of purple fabric half buried in the mud. A child's hoodie. The color was faded, the seams stiff with frost. Mason lifted it gently, heart knocking once against his ribs. Underneath lay a small handkerchief, white but stained along one edge, embroidered with a butterfly. The thread shimmered faintly blue in the weak light, and in one corner, a single word stitched by hand. Lily. Mason's breath caught. He knew that name. Everyone in Fremont County did. 4 years ago, Lily and Emma Parker, 10 and 7, had vanished from a church parking lot 2 towns over. Their faces had been on every diner wall, every grocery bulletin board, until the posters faded and the world decided to forget. But this fabric, this was no relic weathered by years. It smelled faintly of antiseptic, not soil. Someone had been here recently. Someone had tried to keep it clean. "Ranger," Mason murmured. The dog pressed close, nose twitching. His ears flicked back, waiting for command. Mason's instincts screamed at him to mark the location, to call it in. Yet another voice, older, trained, and cold, whispered, "Don't trust easily." Still, he fished out his satellite phone and thumbed the number for the Pine Creek Sheriff's Office. When Deputy Arnett answered, Mason explained what he'd found, every detail precise, professional. Silence followed, then a sigh. "Mr. Cole, we combed that ridge back in 21. Probably some hiker's trash." "It's not trash," Mason snapped. "The fabric's preserved. You send someone up here." "Look, you've been on that mountain alone a long time," Arnett said, voice softening into something close to pity. "Sometimes our minds—" Mason hung up. Ranger whined softly. Mason patted the dog's shoulder. "They won't come. Not yet." He sealed the handkerchief in a freezer bag from his pack and hiked back to the cabin. The sun was dipping behind the ridge, bleeding orange through the snow clouds. Inside, the wood stove hissed alive. Mason sat at the table, the bag resting before him, the word Lily staring back through plastic. For the first time in years, he felt that pulse of purpose again, the one that had driven him through firefights and rubble. He'd buried it deep, along with the guilt that came from losing 2 men under his command. But tonight, it clawed its way back. By nightfall, the ridge was wrapped in mist. Mason drove down the narrow switchbacks into town, Ranger's head resting on the passenger seat. Pine Hollow hadn't changed much. A single traffic light, a grocery, a hardware store, and Ruby's Diner, the only place still open past 8. Mason parked beside a snow-covered pickup and stepped into the warmth of grease and coffee. Behind the counter stood Ben Harper, a man in his mid-50s with a gut that spoke of too many burgers and a face lined by both sun and sorrow. His gray beard was trimmed neat, his eyes alert but weary. He'd run Harper's Hardware for 20 years, and he knew every nail, rumor, and broken soul within 30 miles. "Mason Cole," Ben said, drying a mug with a towel. "Didn't expect to see you off the mountain this late." "Needed some supplies," Mason answered, sliding onto a stool, "and a coffee that doesn't taste like burnt pine." Ben poured him a cup, then leaned on the counter. "How's the dog?" "Still smarter than me." They shared a small grin, one of those unspoken exchanges between men who'd seen too much and talked too little. After a while, Mason pulled the freezer bag from his jacket and laid it on the counter. The light above caught the shimmer of the embroidered butterfly. Ben's hands stilled. "Where'd you find that?" "Behind my ridge near the limestone wall." Ben's eyes darkened. "You know who it belonged to." "I do." Ben exhaled through his nose, set the mug aside. 4 years, Mason. The sheriff called it cold for a reason." "Cold doesn't mean over." Ben's jaw tightened. For a moment he looked older, shoulders sagging beneath the weight of something he'd carried too long. "My niece disappeared the same summer as those Parker girls," he said quietly. "Different county, same silence after. You think folks round here stopped asking questions because they stopped caring? No, because asking got people watched." Mason frowned. By who? Ben shook his head. Doesn't matter. Just, there are things on that mountain that were meant to stay buried. Some of us learned that the hard way. Outside, the wind rattled the diner windows. The neon sign flickered, buzzing like a dying insect. Mason looked at the handkerchief again. Clean thread, antiseptic scent. Someone had been keeping it fresh. Someone who wanted it found, or wanted to remind the mountain it hadn't forgotten. He finished his coffee, slid the bag back into his jacket. Thanks for the warning, Ben, he said. But I'm not good at staying out of things. Ben gave a weary smile, one corner of his mouth twitching. Yeah, he muttered. Didn't think you were. When Mason stepped back into the cold, Ranger lifted his head from the truck seat, eyes bright in the moonlight. Mason scratched behind his ear. Looks like we've got work to do, partner. The shepherd thumped his tail once, low and certain. The mountains loomed silent above them, but somewhere within that silence, something waited, a secret wrapped in rock and time, still breathing beneath the snow. The storm rolled in before dawn, swallowing the mountains in white silence. Mason woke to the soft thud of snow sliding off the roof and the faint sound of Ranger pacing near the door. The dog's instincts had always been sharper than his own, and this morning they hummed with unease. Mason poured black coffee into a tin mug, the bitter steam curling around his face. The handkerchief marked Lily still lay sealed on the counter beside his gloves. He'd spent half the night staring at it, replaying Ben's warning over and over. People didn't just forget 2 missing girls. They were told to. He needed help. Someone who wouldn't think he'd lost his mind. He scrolled through the cracked screen of his old satellite phone until he found the name, Grace Miller. Grace had been the medic in his SEAL unit back in Mosul. 36 now, a little younger than Mason, but tougher than anyone he'd ever met. Back then, she'd been the calm in the chaos, steady hands under gunfire, the kind of person who patched bullet wounds while yelling orders louder than the explosions around her. After leaving the Navy, she'd joined a volunteer search and rescue task force in Colorado. Mason hadn't spoken to her in 2 years. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the call button, then pressed it. Grace Miller. Her voice came through sharp and clear, same as he remembered. It's Mason. A pause, then a laugh, dry as desert sand. You actually learned how to dial a phone. What's wrong? He told her everything. The ridge, the hoodie, the handkerchief, the sheriff's brush-off. When he finished, the line went quiet, except for static. Mason, she said finally, voice lower now. You're saying it smelled like antiseptic? Yeah, fresh. Text me your coordinates. Grace, you don't have to. Shut up and send them. If you're right, we can't sit on this. By noon, her silver Tacoma was grinding up the narrow road toward the cabin, tires biting through snow and mud. When she stepped out, Mason saw the same woman he remembered from Iraq. Tall, lean, skin sun-touched from years outdoors. Her dark auburn hair was braided tight beneath a wool cap, and her hazel eyes missed nothing. She wore a rescue parka lined with reflective tape, heavy-duty boots, and a pistol holstered at her hip. Habit, not show. You still drink coffee like motor oil? She asked. Stronger now, Mason replied. Grace glanced at Ranger, who stood alert beside Mason, tail still but eyes focused. This the famous partner? Ranger, Mason said. 5 years old, retired K-9. Grace crouched, offering the back of her hand. Hey, handsome. Ranger sniffed once, then nudged her wrist with approval. Smart boy, she murmured, scratching under his chin. All right. Show me where you found it. The three of them trekked up the ridge, the snow falling thicker now, filling their tracks as fast as they made them. Grace moved with the precision of a soldier, checking angles, scanning tree lines, reading terrain like a map. She carried a GPS receiver clipped to her jacket, a coil of rope over one shoulder, and a small thermal camera slung across her chest. When they reached the limestone outcrop, Ranger went still again. His nose dropped, breath fogging against the frost. He moved along the brush line, tail stiff, and gave a low bark. Grace brushed aside the tangled branches. "This isn't natural," she muttered. "See the pattern? Someone layered deadwood to look random." Mason knelt beside her, pushing away the debris until the rock face revealed a narrow opening no wider than a doorway. The air that seeped from it was damp and metallic, carrying the unmistakable scent of rust and something else. "Jesus," Grace whispered, flicking on her flashlight. "This goes deeper than it looks." They crawled in, boots crunching over gravel. The ceiling sloped low, forcing them to crouch. Inside, the cold bit through their jackets, and the beam of light caught glints of frost on the walls. Mason's breath echoed back at him in the tight space. Grace swept the floor with the flashlight. "Here," she said. Something small shimmered near a pile of stones. She brushed it free. A silver bracelet, bent slightly, engraved with one word: Emma. Mason felt his throat tighten. Grace's brow furrowed. "You sure this cave wasn't searched before?" "They said they did, but I doubt they came this far off trail." Grace kept scanning. "Look at the ceiling. Tiny slits carved through the stone. Ventilation holes, deliberate, evenly spaced." Mason ran his gloved fingers over one, feeling smooth tool marks. "Someone made sure air could move through here," she said. "Not nature's work." The smell of rust grew stronger as they advanced another few yards. A dark stain marred the ground, old, almost black. Grace crouched to examine it. Iron oxide. Could be blood, could be something else. But someone lived here, or was kept here. They both froze when Ranger growled, his gaze fixed on the shadows beyond the beam of their lights. "Easy, boy," Mason murmured. Then a sound, a crunch of snow outside. Tires, a vehicle engine cutting off. Mason and Grace exchanged looks. "Expecting company?" she whispered. "No." They crept back toward the entrance, Mason's hand instinctively brushing the grip of his sidearm. Outside, through the white haze of snowfall, a black SUV crawled up the narrow trail and stopped beside the ridge. The doors opened, and a tall man in a dark overcoat stepped out, brushing snow from his shoulders. He looked mid-40s, athletic build under his coat, sharp jawline, short-cropped hair, peppered gray at the temples. His face carried the kind of calm confidence that belonged to someone used to being obeyed. He flashed a badge before either of them spoke. "Special Agent Eric Nolan, Department of Homeland Security," he said. His voice was smooth but carried authority. "We received an unusual satellite anomaly from this sector early this morning. Mind telling me what you're doing up here?" Grace folded her arms. "Satellite anomaly?" "Yes, ma'am. Infrared readings indicating possible human activity inside restricted land. You folks found anything?" Mason studied him. The man's eyes were too sharp, too knowing. His SUV had no snow accumulation. He'd been driving a long time, not parked nearby. "You're a little far from Washington," Mason said. "Homeland Security goes wherever it needs to," Nolan replied evenly. He glanced past Mason toward the cave entrance. "May I?" "No," Grace said flatly. "This is a private find until we contact local authorities." Nolan smiled, thin, polite, but without warmth. "I'm afraid federal jurisdiction overrides that. If you've discovered potential evidence related to missing miners, it's my duty to secure the site." He stepped forward, gesturing to two plainclothes agents climbing out of the SUV. "We'll take care of it from here." Grace looked ready to argue, but Mason touched her arm. "Let's not make a scene," he murmured. They watched as Nolan disappeared into the cave, his flashlight beam slicing through the dark. After several minutes, he emerged, carrying the bracelet sealed inside an evidence bag. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "You'll be contacted if we require a statement." Grace's jaw tightened. "You mean if you decide to let this see daylight?" Nolan's eyes flicked to her, unreadable. "Have a safe evening." Then he and his team were gone, tires spitting snow as the SUV wound down the mountain. Grace stared after them. "Something's off. He didn't even log our names." Mason nodded. "That's what scares me." That night, back in town, the two of them met Ben at Harper's Hardware. The shop smelled of sawdust and kerosene, the single heater humming in the corner. Ben looked uneasy when he saw Grace. "You brought backup," he said. "She's the real deal," Mason replied. "Medic, search and rescue." Grace extended a hand. "Grace Miller." Ben's handshake was firm, calloused. "Ben Harper. If you're up here, you already know something's wrong." Over mugs of instant coffee, Ben told them what the town didn't say aloud. Years ago, there'd been a facility deep in the Granite Range, Cedar Creek Youth Center. Officially, it was a camp for troubled kids. Unofficially, it was government-funded and off-grid. "Shut down overnight," Ben said. "Right after a series of lawsuits no one could trace. Files disappeared, funding vanished. Then kids started going missing." Grace exchanged a glance with Mason. "You think they're connected?" Ben nodded grimly. "I think you just stepped into something people have been burying for decades." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, covering the world in white, erasing footprints faster than they could be made. The snow had stopped by nightfall, leaving the ridge drowned in a thin silver mist. From the porch of his cabin, Mason watched the faint glow of headlights fade down the mountain road, the last of Agent Nolan's convoy heading back toward town. Ranger stood beside him, ears twitching, eyes locked on the dark slope beyond the tree line. "Yeah, I know," Mason murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's off." Grace was inside packing equipment: GPS, thermal camera, headlamps, and a fresh battery for her radio. When she stepped back out, the light from the cabin caught her face. Sharp cheekbones, tired eyes, a small cut on her lip she hadn't noticed. Her auburn hair had come loose from the braid, clinging to the side of her neck. "They're not done up there," she said flatly. "I saw two of his men plant motion sensors by the trail before they left. They don't trust anyone near that cave." Mason nodded. "They don't want it found again." Grace zipped her parka. "Then we'd better find what they missed before they erase it." Ranger barked once, as if agreeing. They left the truck a mile from the limestone ridge, hiking the rest under a moonless sky. The air was sharp, freezing hard enough that every breath crystallized. Their headlamps stayed off. Mason's night vision was still sharp, and Ranger's senses sharper. The dog moved ahead, low and silent, his paw prints vanishing instantly beneath falling frost. When they reached the outcrop, the clearing looked different, cleaner. The debris they'd cleared earlier was gone, brush rearranged. It was as though Nolan's men had swept the place, sanitizing every trace. Grace crouched beside a patch of disturbed soil. "Boot tracks," she said. "Small ones. Maybe a woman's. Fresh. Less than a day old." "Not one of us," Mason said. "They had a third agent?" "Maybe," Grace murmured. "Or maybe someone else got here before they did." Ranger sniffed the air and gave a low growl, turning toward the rock wall. His tail stiffened, his posture changing from curious to alert. Mason followed his line of sight and noticed a faint seam in the stone, barely visible behind a curtain of frozen vines. "Grace," he whispered, "there's something behind this." They cleared the vines, revealing a narrow fissure wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. A rush of stale, cold air seeped out, smelling of damp clay and rusted metal. Grace flicked on her flashlight. The beam caught a thin glimmer, a strip of torn flannel snagged on a rock edge. They exchanged a look. Mason ducked inside first, shoulders brushing the walls. Ranger followed, nails clicking softly on the stone. The passage twisted and dipped before opening into a second chamber, smaller than the first, but strangely intact. Grace stepped in behind him, the light sweeping across the space. The beam hit an object near the far wall, a small pile of fabric, blankets thin and torn, laid out like makeshift beds. Candles, melted down to stubs, stood in clusters beside soot stains. The air carried a faint sweetness of wax and smoke, but underneath was something human. Sweat, fear, time. Grace crouched and brushed a fingertip across the dirt. Someone stayed here for months, maybe longer. Mason's jaw tightened. Or someone kept them here. Ranger's nose pressed against the ground, tracing circles. His body tensed near one corner where the wall curved. Mason followed and saw what the dog had noticed. Marks etched into the stone. Crude drawings done in charcoal or ash. Two girls holding hands. A mountain. And beside them, the shape of a large dog, black with pointed ears. Ranger whined softly. Grace stepped closer, her breath catching. "Look at this." She pointed to a torn notebook page pinned under a small rock. The paper was creased, the ink smeared by moisture, but the words were still legible in a child's shaky handwriting. "If he finds us, we're safe." Silence filled the chamber. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Mason felt a knot twist inside his chest. He reached for the page, slid it gently into a plastic sleeve from Grace's pack. "They knew someone was coming," he said quietly. "But who?" Before she could answer, Ranger's ears shot up. The dog turned toward the entrance, body tense, tail rigid. Then came the faint, metallic click, the unmistakable sound of a radio mic being pressed. They killed their lights instantly. Through the darkness, the muffled voice of Agent Nolan drifted from outside the main cavern. His tone was clipped, impatient, transmitted through a comm device. "Yes. Confirm containment perimeter. No locals beyond the trail. Project Haven remains secure." Another voice replied, distorted by static. Mason caught fragments. "Cleanup, data retention, units unaccounted." Nolan again. "Understood. Ensure the remaining subjects don't surface. We can't afford another breach." Grace's fingers found Mason's sleeve in the dark. Her whisper was a razor's edge. "Subjects? He's not talking about evidence. He's talking about people. Mason's pulse hammered in his ears. He'd heard tones like Nolan's before. Commanders managing secrets, not saving lives. Ranger gave a low growl, the kind that trembled in his chest, but made no sound. Mason crouched beside him, stroking his neck gently to calm him. Outside, Nolan's voice drifted closer. No, the search team doesn't need to know details. Tell HQ we'll deliver the assets by Thursday. Then footsteps, the crunch of gravel fading away. They waited another minute before Mason turned on his flashlight again. Grace's face was pale under the beam, her jaw tight. Project Haven, she said. That's what he called it? Mason nodded slowly. Sounds like the kind of name they give to something that isn't supposed to exist. Grace swallowed hard. You think this connects to Cedar Creek? Maybe Cedar Creek was just the front, Mason said. They shut it down publicly, then moved the operation underground, literally. Grace scanned the chamber one last time. We need to document this before they wipe it out. Photos, GPS, samples. Not here, Mason said. If they sweep the area tomorrow, anything digital will be traced. She hesitated. So what do we do? Mason looked at Ranger, then back at her. His voice was steady, low. We take what we can carry. We get out quietly. And then we figure out how deep this hole goes. They packed the evidence, bracelet, drawings, the note, and retraced their steps. Outside, the snow had started again, falling in slow, deliberate flakes. It muffled their footsteps, their breathing, the weight of what they'd just uncovered. Halfway down the trail, Grace stopped and looked back toward the ridge. You realize this means we're in it now, she said. If Nolan's part of this, we can't just turn it in. Mason met her gaze. I know. She exhaled, her breath visible in the cold. What about you? You didn't come up here to be a hero. He looked toward the distant cabin light flickering through the pines. No, he said quietly. But I didn't come up here to run forever either. Ranger barked once, sharp and certain, as if agreeing that turning back was no longer an option. By the time they reached the truck, the snow had already buried their tracks. The mountain stood still again, silent and indifferent, as though it had never whispered its secret at all. Mason glanced once more toward the ridge, the ghost of Nolan's voice still echoing in his head. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Whatever Project Haven is, he said, it ends here. Ranger's ears flicked forward, and Grace nodded beside him. Neither of them spoke again as the truck rolled down the dark road, headlights cutting a narrow path through the falling snow. The mountain loomed behind them, watching, waiting, hiding something far older than secrets and far colder than stone. The sun had barely touched the peaks when Ranger started pacing by the porch. His fur, a deep sable streaked with silver, bristled along the spine. He sniffed the air, turned toward the valley, and gave a single sharp bark. Low, insistent, purposeful. Mason stepped outside, coffee mug still in hand, steam curling into the morning chill. What is it, boy? Ranger barked again, trotted a few yards, then stopped, glancing back. His tail was stiff, ears pointed toward the east. Grace emerged from the cabin, tightening her parka. That's not his usual patrol bark, she said, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her auburn hair was a tangled halo under her wool cap, and fatigue carved lines around her hazel eyes. But there was alertness there, the old soldier's edge. Mason nodded. No, that's him saying, follow me. A pickup truck approached from the trail below, its tires crunching through the frost. Ben Harper climbed out, his heavy flannel jacket hanging loose on his broad frame. His salt and pepper beard was frosted with snow, and despite the years carved into his face, his eyes were sharp, steady, the kind of eyes of a man who'd lost something and was still looking for it. "Couldn't sleep," Ben said. "Heard on the scanner there was federal chatter about the ridge again." "Then you're just in time," Mason replied. "Rangers got something." They grabbed their packs, flashlights, rope, Grace's medical kit, and followed the shepherd down the slope. The trail wound through skeletal aspens and sheets of ice, each step crunching underfoot. Ranger led them with silent precision, moving like he'd done this route 1,000 times. The valley opened before them, framed by cliffs that rose like jagged teeth. At its center, a waterfall thundered down from 50 feet above, its spray freezing into mist. Locals called it Dead End Falls, a place where stories died, the kind of spot hikers swore was cursed, where echoes lasted longer than prayers. Grace squinted through the mist. "No trails, no footprints. You sure about this, Ranger?" The dog didn't answer with sound. He circled the base of the waterfall once, twice, then stopped. His paw scraped against the moss-covered rock. He growled softly, then clawed hard, ripping away the slick green layer. Underneath, a seam of stone appeared, thin but deliberate. Mason pressed his palm against it. "There's a hollow space behind this." Ranger pawed again, more urgent now. Ben stepped closer, resting a hand on Mason's shoulder. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Cedar Creek's ghost," Mason said grimly. "Let's find out." They worked together, prying at the edges until a chunk of moss and rock broke loose, revealing a narrow fissure just wide enough for a person to slip sideways. Cold air breathed from within, smelling of metal, mold, and something faintly chemical. Grace turned on her flashlight. "I'll go first. Smaller shoulders." "You're not smaller," Mason said automatically. Grace shot him a look. "That's not an argument right now." She ducked into the opening, her boots scraping stone. Mason followed, then Ranger, tail brushing against Ben's knee as the older man squeezed in last. Inside, the roar of the waterfall dulled to a low hum. The air was thick, stale. The tunnel twisted and descended gradually, and droplets from the ceiling tapped like a metronome. After several minutes, Grace whispered, "This isn't natural." Mason raised his light. The tunnel walls bore marks, straight, purposeful, carved by tools. "Man-made," he said, "or at least modified." Ranger stopped suddenly. His tail dropped, ears flat, and a low rumble vibrated from his throat. "What is it?" Ben whispered. Before anyone could answer, a faint metallic click echoed behind them, the unmistakable sound of a gun being loaded. "Freeze!" a voice barked, sharp and commanding. They spun around. 3 silhouettes stood at the tunnel entrance, flashlights cutting through the dark. At the front, Agent Eric Nolan. His face was grim, eyes cold beneath the beam of his tactical lamp. He wore a dark parka now, combat pants tucked into boots, and the muzzle of his pistol gleamed as he leveled it at Mason. 2 men flanked him, both armed, both wearing unmarked tactical gear. "Well," Nolan said calmly, "guess I should have known you wouldn't stay put." Mason's voice was steady. "You following us? Or are we still pretending this is a rescue?" "Doesn't matter," Nolan replied. "You've stumbled into restricted ground. I'm placing all of you under federal detainment until this site is secured." "Funny," Grace said, her tone sharp. That's not what Project Haven's rulebook says, is it? Nolan's expression hardened. You don't know what you're talking about. Ranger barked once, loud, defiant. The sound ricocheted through the cavern. Nolan flinched, and in that heartbeat, Mason lunged sideways, grabbing Grace and pulling her deeper into the tunnel. Gunfire exploded. Bullets sparked off stone, flashes lighting the chamber in bursts of white. Ranger leapt ahead, barking furiously, teeth bared. One round struck the rock beside him. Another grazed his shoulder. He yelped, but didn't stop, his body low, driving forward, forcing the attackers to keep their distance. Ben fired once from behind, the crack deafening in the confined space. One of Nolan's men fell with a shout. Go! Mason shouted. They scrambled deeper, the tunnel widening into a chamber so large their lights couldn't touch all the walls. The smell hit them first. Stale air, old smoke, faint decay. And then, movement. In the far corner, 4 small figures huddled together. 2 girls, frail, dirt-streaked, their clothes torn and thin. One looked about 10, the other barely 13. The younger clutched a piece of fabric to her chest, a scrap of the same purple hoodie Mason had found days earlier. Lily? Mason whispered. The girl flinched at his voice, eyes wide, green under the grime. The older one, Emma, her hair tangled and nearly white from dust, stepped in front of her sister, trembling but fierce. Don't hurt us, she rasped. Grace dropped to her knees, raising empty hands. We're not here to hurt you. You're safe now. The girls didn't move. 2 smaller children peered from behind them, a boy no older than 8 and a girl of about 6. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow with exhaustion. My God, Ben murmured. They're still alive. From the tunnel behind them, Nolan's voice echoed. You're making this worse for everyone, Mason. Mason turned, scanning the chamber. Grace, get them behind the rocks. Ben, cover the left flank. Ranger limped to Mason's side, his fur matted with blood. Mason touched his neck gently. Stay with me, buddy. Nolan appeared at the entrance, gun raised, his remaining man close behind. His voice was calm again, but the tremor of anger broke through. You don't understand what you're interfering with. These kids are protected assets. You think you're rescuing them? You're endangering national security. Grace's voice cut through the tension. You mean you're hiding human trafficking under a government seal? Nolan's jaw tightened. You don't know what Haven was meant to fix. Ben stepped forward, shotgun leveled. Only thing that needs fixing here is you. Before Nolan could react, Ben fired. The blast echoed like thunder, dropping the second gunman instantly. The shockwave filled the chamber with ringing silence. Nolan ducked behind a rock, returning fire wildly. Bullets ricocheted, chipping stone. Grace dove forward, catching him from the side. They collided hard, her knee slamming into his ribs. The gun clattered away, spinning across the dirt. Mason rushed in, pinning Nolan's arm behind his back, forcing him down. Who are you working for? He snarled. Nolan's breath came ragged. You think you're saving them, Cole? You're just one man against the system. Maybe, Mason growled, tightening his grip. But I'm not alone. Behind him, Ranger stood between the rescued children and the tunnel, body low, blood dripping from his fur, a deep growl vibrating in his chest. His eyes were locked on the darkness, daring anything to move. For a moment, the cave fell utterly silent, except for the roar of water from beyond the walls. Then Grace spoke softly. We need to get them out. Now. Mason looked at Nolan, unconscious now from the hit, then at Ben, who reloaded quietly. The kids huddled together under Grace's jacket. Ranger limped to Mason's side, pressing his muzzle against Mason's hand. The man smiled faintly. "Good work, soldier." The shepherd exhaled, steady, loyal, unbroken, and as they stepped toward the light filtering faintly from the entrance, Mason knew this wasn't over. This was only the beginning of what the mountain had buried. The storm that had haunted Granite Ridge finally broke. When dawn came, the valley shimmered under thin light, every pine tip crowned with frost. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that followed chaos, where the wind no longer carried the sound of gunfire, but something quieter, heavier. Within days, the ridge transformed into a city of flashing lights. Black SUVs lined the old service road. The air buzzed with radios and drone rotors. Federal agents in dark windbreakers marked the perimeter with yellow tape. The emblem of the FBI gleamed under the winter sun like an apology too late to matter. Mason stood near the cabin porch, his jacket unzipped, the cold biting at his throat. Ranger lay at his feet, shoulder bandaged, but tail thumping lazily every few minutes, as if reassuring Mason that he wasn't going anywhere. The German shepherd's coat had lost some of its gloss, fur near the wound streaked with pale gray, but his eyes were alive, still scanning every movement, still guarding. Grace stood beside Mason, coffee in one hand, her expression tight and unreadable. The scar above her eyebrow, earned from the fight inside the cave, caught the light. She'd cut her hair short since that night, saying it was just easier, though Mason suspected it was her way of shedding everything that had happened down there. "They found another chamber," she said quietly, nodding toward the line of agents moving along the ridge. Smaller, empty, but they found traces of children's medication, food rations, and blankets. Mason didn't answer. He'd run out of words that morning when the FBI had finished taking Nolan away. The man had walked in silence, his face bloodless, the arrogance gone. Even handcuffed, he'd managed to glance back once at Mason, a look that wasn't hatred, but something stranger, relief almost. Special Agent Lauren Pierce, the lead investigator now in charge, approached them. She was in her early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of woman who looked like she'd survived more than one bureaucratic war. Her brown hair was tied in a low bun, her face serious, but not cold. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice even. "You've done something remarkable here." "Wasn't looking for remarkable," Mason replied. She nodded slightly. "Maybe not. But you pulled a thread no one else would touch. Project Haven was buried deep. Half the files were labeled under different programs. Foster care reform, behavioral rehabilitation, even military youth outreach. It took us weeks to piece together how far it went." She handed him a folder. Inside were photos, satellite maps, redacted memos, names. It wasn't just Cedar Creek. There were 5 other sites across 3 states. We're still uncovering them. Grace exhaled. So it was national. Worse, Pierce said. It was profitable. She left them with the file and a promise of updates, though Mason knew how these things went. Once the story lost its shock value, the headlines would move on. Someone somewhere would bury the truth again under more paperwork. When the agents finally cleared out, the mountain returned to its natural rhythm. Wind through pines, water dripping from stone, the occasional echo of a bird call that sounded almost like laughter. Mason stayed behind, refusing interviews, turning away reporters who came asking for the hero of Granite Ridge. He didn't feel like one. He'd just followed the only voice that still made sense. Rangers. Grace stayed for a while, long enough to help relocate the rescued kids. Lily and Emma were the hardest to let go. The sisters clung to Ranger during every handoff, the younger one whispering into the dog's ear like she was telling him a secret. Eventually, a foster family from Idaho, both teachers, kind faces, no press ties, took them in. Grace had vetted them herself. Ben Harper, despite his age, moved faster than anyone expected. Within a month, he'd formed a volunteer network called the Hollow Light Project, dedicated to helping families of missing children. He held meetings in the back of his hardware store, surrounded by shelves of nails and lanterns. His hands still trembled sometimes when he spoke, but his voice never did. "None of us should have needed a man and his dog to remind us what justice means," he said at one gathering. Mason didn't attend, but he heard about it later, and it stayed with him. 3 months passed. The snow melted into soft earth, and spring crept up the valley like a hesitant visitor. The cabin had been repainted by townsfolk, an unspoken thank you. 2 new chairs sat on the porch, built by Ben, their wood uneven but sturdy. Ranger liked to lie between them, chin on his paws, eyes half closed. One afternoon, a rust-colored SUV pulled into the drive. 4 teenagers climbed out, high school journalism students armed with notepads, recorders, and awkward determination. The group leader, a tall boy with messy blonde hair and round glasses, introduced himself as Eli Sanders. "We're doing a project called Local Heroes, sir," he said, his voice cracking halfway through. "Can we ask you some questions?" Mason hesitated but finally waved them to the porch. Grace wasn't there. She'd gone back to Colorado 2 weeks earlier, promising to return if you ever start brooding again. Mason suspected she meant when, not if. The kids asked about the rescue, about bravery, about loss. Mason answered what he could. Ranger watched them the whole time, tail flicking occasionally, head tilting whenever the word hero came up. After nearly an hour, the youngest girl, freckles scattered across her nose, asked softly, "Why do you still live here, after everything that happened?" Mason looked at the dog lying beside him. Ranger's ears twitched as if he understood the question too. Mason smiled faintly. "Because when everyone else stopped listening," he said, "he didn't." The students fell silent. The boy with glasses turned off his recorder like he understood that was the end of the story. But for Mason, it wasn't. That night, after the kids drove away, Mason stood alone on the porch. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the trees in a low, mournful tune. Ranger stirred beside him, lifting his head. His fur shimmered under the lantern light, silver now, not black. He'd aged in these months, slower to rise, more deliberate in his steps, but his eyes burned with the same fierce awareness. Down in the valley, the sound of engines echoed faintly. Government trucks again, maybe cleanup crews, maybe something else. Mason's hand instinctively dropped to Ranger's collar. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "It's probably nothing." But Ranger didn't relax. His ears pinned forward, nose twitching. The low growl that came next wasn't fear, it was warning. Mason peered into the dark, following Ranger's gaze toward the distant tree line. The forest beyond the ridge was still, but somewhere within it, a light flickered once, then vanished. He felt that old, familiar pull, the one that had dragged him into this nightmare to begin with. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Ranger rose slowly, body tense but steady, and looked back at Mason, waiting for the command. Mason exhaled. "Not tonight," he murmured. But even as he said it, he couldn't take his eyes off that place where the light had been. The sign Ben had carved hung just above the porch steps, its letters rough and uneven from a shaky hand. He barked for the ones no one else could hear. The wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of a bark somewhere deep in the forest. Low, distant, uncertain whether it belonged to memory or something still alive. Mason turned toward the sound, the corners of his mouth tightening. Not a smile, not quite fear, just knowing. And the night, once again, started to listen.